speaking of, people appearing and disappearing from the project, moving on, let's talk about the disappearance of Satoshi. So he was on the project for a couple of years and really leading the project, and some developers had come in, and we can talk about those developers. And there were a couple events that might have caused Satoshi's disappearance at that particular time. So Peter, do you want to kick it off and talk about that era in Bitcoin's history?
Well, that one's tough because, of course, people these days have incentives to misrepresent that and present themselves as having, more play in the project than they necessarily actually did. And at least the impression I get is, I think, first of all, Satoshi obviously picked pseudo-anonymity for a reason. And more than just being pseudo-anonymous, I mean, a subtlety of what Satoshi did that I think a lot of people don't realize is Satoshi never actually used cryptography themselves. Satoshi did not sign emails. Satoshi, as far as we can tell, literally never PGP signed a single thing. We have no evidence that that PGP key on the Bitcoin.org website was ever used. Other than that one transaction, I mean, we can't say that any digital signature was ever created by Satoshi, which is interesting because it means that all of Satoshi's writings kind of stand alone because we can't actually link them to each other. So what I get out of that, knowing kind of the cypherpunk movement and that kind of ethos, is Satoshi intended very early on to leave the project. If Satoshi had intended to stay, Satoshi would have used cryptography to establish a pseudo-anonymous identity, but they didn't. And I think, I think that's a subtlety people forget about. So, of course, yes, there's a famous kind of, discussion around WikiLeaks potentially accepting Bitcoin and stuff, but I don't think that, I mean, it may be kind of a trigger, but I wouldn't say it was a trigger in the sense that it changed Satoshi's plan. I think it might have gone and pushed things a little forward, but, ultimately, I just do not get the impression Satoshi had any intent of staying in Bitcoin longer than necessary. I think, from day zero, they had intended, I'll bootstrap this thing, get other people interested, get other people developing, and then I'm out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would go as far to say I could totally believe that Satoshi has, deliberately burnt their coins, for instance, and thrown away all their private keys. Like if they'd kept that stuff, there'd be a lot of temptation to spend some of it. And there's very little evidence of that. Of course, there's also very little evidence against. It's because of how Satoshi operated. It's just hard to pin down anything to them. So, I think that was deliberate. Yeah, that's what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, it was. Do you think Bitcoin could have worked if Satoshi had revealed who they were, their real world identity?
I mean, I think it could have, but it would provide a barrier. Mm-hmm. It's so much easier when the entity identified with a project doesn't have any other attributes to them. Mm-hmm. If you're the creator of something, you want that image to be just of the creator of something. You don't want anything mixed in there. You don't want any controversy. You want to be this mythical figure who disappeared. Yeah. That's such a great way to kind of lead things. And in terms of like legality, it probably made things a lot easier because there wasn't that, no government. If Satoshi disappears, no government can say, yeah, we jailed Satoshi, don't do this.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think the exact same thing is that, I think Satoshi knew. I think this was always the plan. I think there's a couple of indications, and maybe it's like, the context of looking backwards and hunting for those little hints, but, after it already happened. But still, I think there is plenty of indication that this was the plan from the beginning. And Gavin Andreessen having a meeting with the CIA, and then in combination with WikiLeaks, basically, everything back in those days felt like life and death. Like it was like if there was good news for Bitcoin, it was so like if Bitcoin was ever in the mainstream, like it felt like, oh my God, like this is such a huge freaking deal. And then if there was ever like bad news, like a huge hack or Silk Road getting shut down, it was like, this is it, it's dead. You know, it's like the volatility of whether or not this thing was going to live or die was much, much higher, or at least as an observer for me, back in those days. But, you know, Gavin Andresen meets with the CIA and WikiLeaks at the exact same, or right around the exact same time. They get all of this money frozen in the banking system, and they immediately, you know, are accepting Bitcoin because this is the thing, right? It's like censorship resistant. And I think there was actually a comment from Satoshi, like this is a little early. Like, we don't want that much attention right now. Like, let's calm down or whatever. But then it was like within a couple of weeks, it was just like, it just went silent. And I think it was just Satoshi was always getting to that point, and it was looking like Bitcoin was going to survive on its own by then anyway. And it was like, this is just an opportunity for me to step away, because the more I am here and the more I'm able to be attacked, the more damaging it could be for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin would have survived either way, but the ethos, that myth of this creator that we don't know anything about and who's potentially burned their coins, the keys for all of their coins, and that kind of immaculate conception thing, is I think is incredibly powerful, and I think it makes a huge difference in the legitimacy and the independence, I guess you could say, of the Bitcoin system. There's no person to attack, no matter how much we want to put somebody at the head of it. There's really just nothing there. It's an empty seat.
Yeah, and I think that's just the ethos of Bitcoin, right? I mean, it's a decentralized system, and I think having a centralized party be sort of at the creator, have their identity known, is, you know, the antithesis of this ethos of Bitcoin. So I absolutely agree with you. And yeah, there were. I mean, Peter, go ahead.
Greg Maxwell has a kind of great line that he tells people who, you know, get interested essentially in, well, who Satoshi is, and he basically says, well, it's bizarre to put so much attention on Satoshi when their greatest creation was a system where their identity doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a perfect way to put it. Maxwell has a penchant for boiling things down. He also has a penchant for writing super, super long posts.
Yeah.
So he does both. Yeah. So the WikiLeaks event, I agree. I think that was, you know, Satoshi's intention with both of you from the beginning. Satoshi seemed to understand that completely. The WikiLeaks event, there's a quote about that. He said that it would have been great to get the attention in either context, but WikiLeaks has kicked the hornet's nest and the swarm is headed toward us. That was when WikiLeaks was canceled. And basically any donations were not allowed by the centralized banking system to WikiLeaks.
I've talked to Julian Assange personally about this, and Bitcoin saved WikiLeaks. It's as simple as that. I mean, if Bitcoin did not exist, WikiLeaks would not have existed. And Bitcoin, WikiLeaks is not the only organization like this. Apparently, Sci-Hub is in a similar position where, you know, not quite as fair as WikiLeaks, but, you know, Bitcoin's one of the key things that made the difference and let them stay online, apparently.
Yeah,
there was a post from WikiLeaks a couple of years, like 3 or 4 years or something after this, is that they had like $14 million frozen through the banking system when they had this big crackdown. And they basically had to go full Bitcoin at the time. And luckily, so many of their advocates were already Bitcoiners, just because, you know, the whole community and WikiLeaks and everything was married together basically from the get-go. But they made this post some years later saying, thank you for freezing our bank accounts and all of our funds, because we just wrote a 10,000%, you know, like double bull market that we would have missed because you know, because we were still relying on MasterCard and our bank account and being forced into it. We are in a much better financial position. So we really appreciate it. Thank you, totalitarian governments.
Well, Edward Snowden has said too that he paid for the servers that he transferred data to Glenn Greenwald with Bitcoin. So it's a great example of how both of those are great examples of how Bitcoin is important for freedom.